Horst, the Bible as a two testament collection of writings in the science faith dialogue.
I know most people don't use scripts when they present at ASA, but that's what I'm used to, so that's what I'm going to do. Hope it's okay. Science faith discussions often consider biblical texts, especially those texts that do not align straightforwardly with current scientific consensus. Obvious examples include biblical material related to creation, the fall, the flood, and passages that potentially evoke an ancient Near Eastern snow globe model of the cosmos with a heavenly dome covering a flat earth, which we, of course, were just talking about. Often the biblical themes in question begin with a particular account of an Old Testament text, and then subsequent biblical texts allude back to that account in some way. For example, the flood is initially narrated in Genesis, then referenced in the prophets Isaiah and Ezekiel, as well as a number of New Testament writings, including Matthew, Luke, Hebrews, and 1st and 2nd Peter. To treat the biblical theme of the flood fully involves not only addressing accounts in Genesis, but also the subsequent allusions in other books, especially if any of these subsequent allusions do not easily cohere with one's treatment of Genesis. As a New Testament scholar, I have at times found myself frustrated with how biblical themes are addressed in science faith discussions. The Bible is often treated monolithically, without sensitivity to the differences between the testaments or the diversity among texts. Continuing with the example of the flood, certain scholars work with the notion that the Great Deluge can be understood as a regional flood in a real past, which was interpreted in grand theological terms. Such treatments do not address 2 Peter, which alludes to the flood in a manner that sounds much more universal and globally catastrophic. Quote, "In the last days, scoffers will come, scoffing and indulging their own lusts and saying, 'Where is the promise of his coming? For ever since our ancestors died, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation.' They deliberately ignore this fact that by the word of God, heavens existed long ago, and an earth was formed out of water and by means of water, through which the world of that time was deluged with water and perished. But by the same word, the present heavens and earth have been reserved for fire, being kept until the day of judgment and destruction of the godless." End quote. Here, the primordial flood is said to have caused the perishing of the world, and is set in parallel to a future fiery destruction on the day of judgment, which is presumably global. Not only that, but the text appeals to the flood as proof that God could potentially disrupt the natural order of creation in the future, since God has done so before. If the flood in question was simply local, this argument seems not to hold up. My point is not that 2 Peter ruins the local flood interpretation. My point is rather that this passage should be addressed in some way for an argument involving a local flood to be convincing. The goal of this paper is to challenge my peers engaged in science faith dialogue to treat the Bible with greater sensitivity to its form as a two testament collection of writings. I emphasize the two testament nature of the Bible because the Old and New Testaments serve fundamentally different roles within the biblical canon and emerge from fundamentally different contexts. I emphasize that the Bible is a collection of writings in that even within a given testament, individual texts have particularities that are also important to interpretation. I will begin by discussing three factors pertinent to science faith dialogue that create distance between the Old and New Testaments, namely differences in genre, differences in the state of scientific knowledge, and differences in science education. I will then discuss two more factors that highlight the particularities of individual texts, namely a given author's level of education and a given text's aims. My discussion will be necessarily cursory. In some cases, apparent contradictions between modern science and biblical narratives are addressed with appeals to genre. For example, the early chapters of Genesis are often classified as something like myth, suggesting they serve to communicate paradigmatic truths about human existence and or theological claims over against similar but polytheistic ancient myths. We just heard about that a minute ago, rather than expressing anything about historical events. In certain other analyses, this material is classified as theological history, meaning the stories are based on real events but are crafted to prioritize the communication of theological truths rather than accurate historical details. Regardless of how one assesses these treatments of Old Testament material, the genre classification of a text like Genesis within its ancient literary context does not tell us much about how we should understand New Testament passages that engage earlier biblical narratives. The authors of the New Testament were part of a Second Temple Jewish milieu in which key biblical events were routinely interpreted in ways that made sense in then contemporaneous contexts. If, for example, we want to understand Paul's treatment of Adam and Eve, we will gain more insight by looking to other Second Temple Jewish discussions, of which there were many, than by attempting to reconstruct what those responsible for composing Genesis understood to be the significance of the material. Some authors involved in science-faith dialogue do a good job of attending to the Second Temple context of New Testament interpretations of Genesis, particularly in reference to Adam and Eve. But in other cases, the genre of an early biblical story is discussed without consideration of the differing genre of related New Testament material. So, for example, tensions between modern scientific insights and the flood narrative of Genesis can potentially be addressed by categorizing Genesis according to a certain ancient literary genre. But if a New Testament text like 2 Peter also makes historical claims about the flood that do not cohere with modern science, then an issue still remains to be resolved. A persuasive science-faith analysis of a theme like the flood that spans both testaments requires a sensitivity to the genre of each text that makes claims about the flood, not just the main text that does so. In addition to the genre differences that potentially divide the testaments, differences in the state of science between the times when Old and New Testament writings were composed is another significant consideration. As modern people living in an era of unprecedentedly rapid discovery, we might be inclined to think of the biblical texts as emerging from a time of uniform scientific ignorance. But in actuality, the state of human knowledge in the Mediterranean world was quite different in the 1st century CE in comparison to a handful of centuries earlier. The shape of the earth is a key example. The creation narrative of Genesis and other Old Testament passages are often understood to express a snow globe cosmology in which the sky is a dome-like structure extending above a flat earth with an underworld beneath, as was the typical understanding of the ancient Near East. This is certainly a defensible approach to Genesis, but the era of the New Testament is a different story. By the time of the New Testament texts were composed, it had been unanimously known for centuries among Greco-Roman astronomers and geographers that the earth is spherical. Not only that, but in the 3rd century BCE, as many of you know, Eratosthenes of Cyrene managed to calculate the circumference of the earth by comparing the differing lengths of shadows in 2 different cities at noon on the summer solstice. His figure was not as accurate as modern measurements, but given the imprecision of the information available to him, we can pretty much credit him with getting the earth's size right. So then, the globe was understood to a much greater extent by the 1st century than in the time of Genesis. Some science-faith treatments assume too quickly that the authors of the New Testament held to the ancient Near Eastern model of the cosmos, despite the advancements in knowledge about the natural world that had taken place over the preceding several centuries. For example, certain scholars assume Paul's comment that at the name of Jesus every knee should bend in heaven and on earth and under the earth is an evocation of the sort of 3-tier or snow globe cosmology that was arguably contemporary with the authorship of Old Testament passages, certain Old Testament passages. The knowledge of the spherical earth among all astronomers and geographers, and generally among well-educated people of Paul's day, provides good reason to question the idea that Paul expresses this earlier cosmology in his letter. Geographical knowledge also expanded significantly between the time of Genesis and the time of the New Testament. The scope of the world as it was understood at the time when the early chapters of Genesis were written is probably well summarized by the table of nations that follows the account of Noah and the flood. The land in question includes approximately the regions immediately surrounding the Mediterranean Sea, plus the Arabian Peninsula and a bit more of northern Africa. The lands immediately surrounding the Mediterranean Sea seem to comprise Homer's geographical awareness as well, from around the same time. However, by the 1st century CE, Greco-Roman knowledge of the world had expanded significantly to include roughly all of what is now considered Europe, many of the North Atlantic islands, and the bulk of Asia and Africa. It is not a given that any particular New Testament author was informed about the cutting edge of 1st century geography, but it is fair to say that when an educated person of the 1st century refers to the world, they have a much larger frame of reference in mind than was available to the people involved in producing writings like Genesis. It is also significant that by the time of the New Testament texts were written, speculation had been widespread for centuries that the spherical earth included additional habitable zones in the southern and western hemispheres. They looked at the whole globe and said, well, what we know about is in one section, what's in the other sections? that in all likelihood were populated by humans, but which were not reachable from the Mediterranean world at that time. The discovery of the continents of Australia and North and South America has largely vindicated this speculation. So even though the entire globe had not been mapped, people of high education not only knew the approximate size of the Earth, but also had a basic sense that as yet undiscovered land masses existed in all 4 geographical quadrants, and that humans walked these lands. It follows that when we compare Old Testament passages concerning the world to New Testament passages that interpret the Old Testament passages, the New Testament authors are thinking of a different world than the one conceived by the earlier Old Testament authors, and this may have interpretive implications. For example, Carol A. Hill's worldview approach to the flood understands the event in reference to the worldview of the ancient Mesopotamians who passed on the story. Thus, the deluge in question was not a global flood, but rather a local flood that essentially wiped out the whole of the world as it was known to those who recounted the event to later generations. This is certainly an innovative way of reckoning with the flood narrative of Genesis and other primordial accounts of that ilk, but the expanding scope of geographical knowledge presents us with an additional hermeneutical issue vis-a-vis the New Testament. Hebrews refers to Noah respecting God's warning and building an ark for his family by which he condemned the world. 2 Peter likewise states that God did not spare the ancient world, but rather brought a flood on a world of the ungodly, with the result that the world of that time was deluged with water and perished. These New Testament authors would have understood the world in much larger terms than ancient Mesopotamians could have. Although an ancient flood essentially confined to the Fertile Crescent is arguably scientifically plausible, the same cannot be said for a flood that spans anything like the world that was known in the milieu of the New Testament authors. So the flooding of the world, according to Hebrews and 2 Peter, provides us with a science-faith issue that to my knowledge has not yet been addressed. And I'm sorry I haven't cracked it yet, so I'm not going to solve it for you today. But if I do crack it, I'll let you know. The contexts of the Old and New Testaments are separated not only by advances in fields like astronomy and geography, but also by the development of education about the natural world, what we would call science education. Although firm information about ancient Israelite education is scarce, the available evidence suggests that the socio-cultural context of a text like Genesis would not have included anything recognizable to us as science education. By contrast, those fortunate enough to continue their education through adolescence in the Greco-Roman world would commonly learn many of the rudiments of astronomy, anatomy, botany, mineralogy, and zoology, in order that they would be better able to understand references to these topics in the various poetic texts typically studied in this phase of education. Those privileged enough to enjoy a particularly well-rounded educational track would also receive significant instruction in mathematics, medicine, and geography, among other topics. In addition to formal avenues of education, ancient Roman cities commonly hosted public lectures, and although literature and history were the most common subjects, scientific topics were not unusual, especially the particularly popular topic of astronomy. It is also noteworthy that school lessons were often held in public places where passersby would sometimes listen in and perhaps even chime in with questions. Suffice it to say, the first century Mediterranean world presented at least part of the population with opportunities for learning about the workings of the natural world that were not available in the context of Old Testament writings like Genesis. So whereas in the ancient Near Eastern world, an up-to-date knowledge of the movement of heavenly bodies was really only in the purview of experts, in the world of the New Testament, the rudiments of astronomy were widely mediated to cultured students of high education, a group that probably includes some number of New Testament authors, maybe even all of them. Although it is essential that we be mindful of advancements in both science and science education by the first century era, it is also important not to assume that every New Testament author possessed the most up-to-date knowledge about the natural world. For example, in his book on Scripture and Cosmology, Kyle Greenwood takes for granted that the New Testament authors understood the earth to be a sphere and interprets various elements of their writings accordingly, based on the fact that the spherical shape of the earth was common knowledge among astronomers and geographers at the time. However, there is some limited historical evidence that acceptance of the spherical earth was not universal in the Greco-Roman world of the New Testament era. The first century Roman author Pliny the Elder draws a distinction between learned people, who acknowledge the spherical nature of the earth, and the common herd who scoffed that any human standing on the bottom half of the globe would surely fall off. Pliny does not specify details about the level of education that would distinguish his common herd from the learned, but given the basic scientific information generally taught to students who continued their education through adolescence, i.e. those said to have a robust secondary education, This seems as good a place as any to imagine the distinction. The question of whether the authors of the New Testament accepted the spherical model of the earth, or more generally, the level of education we can reasonably attribute to particular authors, is too complex to do justice to here. I address this topic in greater detail in an article forthcoming in Perspectives on Science and Christian Faith, if you're interested. Here, I will simply say that I think we can reasonably assume that for the New Testament writings that evidence the highest level of education, this would be Hebrews, James, Peter, Jude, and Luke, Acts, that education very likely included significant instruction in the rudiments of scientific topics like astronomy. And if you're learning astronomy in this world, you'd think about the two spheres, the terrestrial sphere and the celestial sphere. So you would think about a spherical Earth if you have know the first thing about astronomy in this world. For writings that evidence a moderate level of education, this might be Matthew and the Pauline letters, there's a decent chance that the authors had some scientific instruction. For writings that show the least evidence of high education among the New Testament texts, these would be Mark, Revelation, and the Johannine literature, we really can't claim much with confidence. All this to say, the texts of the New Testament are not uniform with respect to what we can assume about the author's knowledge of the natural world, so an appreciation of each author's particularities will be important for certain academic projects. In addition to potential differences in education level, it must be borne in mind that specific biblical texts have particular argumentative aims that can be determined, with some degree of confidence at least, through literary analysis. Even two writings by the same author may differ in their goals, and as a result, particular subjects might be treated in different ways for rhetorical reasons. For example, I have argued elsewhere that the notion of death coming to humanity through Adam works rather differently in Romans compared to 1 Corinthians, even though both letters were written by Paul. In 1 Corinthians, death through Adam refers to physical death, and thus human mortality, but it appears that the death in question is natural rather than alien to God's creation. In Romans, the death that enters the world through Adam is clearly alien to God's creation, but it appears to be a metaphor for moral bondage, not necessarily a reference to bodily mortality. The two different ways that Paul discusses death through Adam corresponds to the particular rhetorical aims of these writings. In 1 Corinthians, Paul is attempting to promote cohesion among the Corinthian believers and discourage excessive conformity to the culture outside the community. For this reason, Paul also emphasizes that the world in the present age is corrupt and intrinsically problematic, and in Christ it is coming to an end. With respect to Adam, Paul emphasizes that humans share the dusty mortal body with which Adam was created from the soil of the ground. By contrast, in Romans, Paul appears to be encouraging the Roman believers to try and get along with the surrounding culture due to persecution that was taking place. For this reason, he emphasizes the intrinsic goodness of the created world despite present corruption. With respect to Adam, Paul discusses the inception of moral death, or spiritual death if you like, through the transgression of Eden. So an appreciation of the particular aims of each letter can help us to notice important aspects of the uniqueness of each, in a way that, in this case, is quite relevant to science faith interests. If we simply attempt to understand Paul's thought in a homogeneous way, we will miss important details and potentially arrive at problematic conclusions. In closing, I propose that a greater application of the a greater appreciation of the particularities of each testament and of specific writings within each testament will facilitate more sophisticated and precise treatments of the Bible in future science-faith dialogue. Such sensitivity will require collaboration and cooperation between biblical specialists and the thinkers of various other disciplines who engage in science-faith dialogue. This will not be the easiest path, but it will surely be fruitful. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Bill. Real interesting. I'm just curious, if you go back to the slide on the different education levels of the different New Testament writers, where you think that James and Peter might have been more highly educated than Paul. That seems like kind of a surprise to me.
Sure. Well, and so I should say what we're talking about is what level of education is evidenced in the text. So if one finds out, and this isn't just me, this is based on various and sundry commentaries and other treatments of these texts. But yeah, if I see evidence for a certain level of education in Hebrews and I don't see that same level of education evidenced in Paul, it doesn't mean he couldn't have been more educated than we see, but I can only assume what I can observe. The analysis here would be based on things like the sophistication of the grammar, the vocabulary, evidence of specific things like when someone was in the third level of education, it was called a rhetorical education. They learned certain rhetorical techniques that we see in a text like James, but we do not see in, there's actually there's quite a lot of scholarly debate on specifically, did Paul have a rhetorical education? A lot of people would say he did, in which case he belongs in the yellow text there. But there's a relatively, forceful case that's been made that he didn't. So I'm not trying to solve that today, but it's not clear what level Paul had. And it also, if you're thinking about specifically the social location that we would imagine for someone like James versus Paul, you would need to keep in mind that typically a text isn't prepared by just one. Someone didn't just sit down and write. They worked with a secretary. The secretary may just take dictation, but more often they had a role in composing a text, and in some cases, a secretary just got down the gist of what someone wanted to say and then wrote it. So we're not necessarily talking, like, what I may be hearing you say is, if indeed James, the brother of Jesus, is the author, he's a farmer from Israel. You wouldn't expect him to know as much as Paul, who's clearly a privileged person who lived in major urban centers, which is true. But if James is working with a secretary, it may be the secretary whose influence shows it is a more sophisticated Greek in James than in Paul for sure. But it may not be James himself who is responsible for that. Texts were generally composed kind of by committee. So,
could you go back to the slide where Paul was using death differently in 1 Corinthians? Yeah.
Yep.
So, could you explain these different ways of approaching death by Paul using those Second Temple interpretive methods like Pesher and Midrash to take certain things out of the Old Testament context and respinning them to meet a contemporary need or a contemporary argument?
Sure. And I will, anyone who's interested in this slide in particular, I have an article from a couple years ago in Science and Christian Belief where I make this case in detail. So I didn't attempt to, it would take me the whole paper just to give my argument for what I'm doing here. But I think the fastest way I can do this is to address your question is people, Jewish thinkers and authors of this time did look at the biblical text and look at their contemporary questions, their contemporary interests, their contemporary knowledge, and like we would, that shapes what we're seeing and how we talk about it. I don't have a lot of insight in particular to, such and such given technique and how that shapes the difference here. But what I see is that there's a difference in what's definitely clear in how Paul talks about death through Adam in each text. And this corresponds really well to things people have identified about the cosmology of each text, or how the cosmos is constructed in 1 Corinthians versus Romans. There's a fairly popular book by Edward Adams where he talks about this exegetically. He's not talking about science, faith stuff at all. But making the case that in 1 Corinthians, there's a sense that the boundaries of the community need to be protected because there's a certain number of privileged people in Corinth who are too aligned with the outside culture. They're too secular, if you like. And so Paul is trying to say, you need to, not be so married to the world and be more pure, I guess. And the way he constructs, the argument that Adams makes is the way he constructs the cosmos, the way Paul's cosmology as expressed in 1 Corinthians aligns with that, in that he's treating the world like it is fundamentally a corrupt, thing. And the Christian should look forward to essentially participating in the new creation and being set free from this corrupt, dying world. So that aligns well with not being so accommodated to the surrounding culture. Whereas in Romans, it appears that there was persecution of Christians happening of some sort, and that shows up a number of times in the text. And it appears that, socially speaking, Paul wants the Romans to get along better with the surrounding context, because that'll maybe help with being less persecuted. Being more of a sect is going to be problematic for the Christian community in Rome. And the way that Paul talks about cosmology in Romans matches that. You're talking more about a good creation that is given over temporarily to suffering and problems and corruption, but it'll be restored in the future. And so that corresponds a little bit, emphasizing the intrinsic goodness of creation aligns with, guys, you need to be better able to live lives that are recognized as good among your, non-Christian neighbors, basically. Now, this doesn't mean that Paul's contradicting himself, I don't think. It's more about which aspects of the truth he's highlighting in a way that serves his, didactic purposes for the communities. But it does align well with, so what I do with this is look at death through Adam and say, well, in 1 Corinthians, it's clear that Paul's talking about mortality when he talks about death through Adam, but it's not clear that he's talking about something that has invaded creation. And that actually aligns really well with the idea that corruption is fundamental to the world. Whereas in Romans, it's clear that Paul's talking about death through Adam as something that's alien to God's creation. It has entered in through one man and so forth. But it's not clear if you go through. There's really nothing that makes it have to be that the physical death of the body has to be part of that in Romans. So I'm arguing that Paul talks about death through Adam in two different ways. And if you accept both of those, then there's no reason that human mortality couldn't be something that has always been present in the course of whatever human evolution and so forth. But at the same time, a moral fall, would work as well. And that's not just special pleading. I want to square the circle by fixing Paul. It actually makes sense based on what else is going on in these texts.
Yes, we're all educated here, I think, and we all know that the sun doesn't rise. But we use that language. Mm-hmm. We just accept it, and we accommodate because that's the common way we say the sun rose this morning at a certain time. My question is, and go back to your first slide where you were worrying about the flood and the way it's talked about in Peter. I guess my question is, why is it a problem to simply say that Peter was accommodating the understood the fact of the flood in the Old Testament and leave it at that? Or are you demanding some extra?
Yeah. The reason I don't feel satisfied with that is that the rhetoric being used here falls apart if the flood was not a worldwide catastrophe. Because what Peter is saying, and this isn't true just because a New Testament author mentions the flood, that doesn't make a problem. But I think if you look at how this passage is working, the logic is God has brought a worldwide catastrophe before, therefore, or if you don't want to say catastrophe, a transformation of creation. God has disrupted creation radically before, and therefore it's not ridiculous to think that God would do so again in an eschatological way. So if we're talking about a certain, either something is a myth that we derive life lessons from or something about God, but didn't actually happen, or it happened locally and it's just talked about as global. It seems to me that the rhetoric doesn't actually hold up then. And so if we are treating this as an authoritative text, that seems difficult to me. Now, my point isn't to say, well, we should throw out everything and believe the whole earth was covered in water, because that doesn't really work well with our best scientific reflections. But my point is, I don't feel we've solved this I don't think it's adequate just to say, well, 2 Peter was, Peter or whoever was involved in producing this text was just talking to people in a way that they could understand, because he's basically tricking them, if that's the case, in this passage. We could debate that, and that's fine. Like I said, I haven't cracked this one yet. I don't have the answer for how to fix this problem, but I would posit that it is a problem that persists even if we do a really smart analysis of Genesis that tells us, well, in the context of Genesis, we can understand the passage a certain way where it doesn't contradict our science, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you.